Between 2009 and 2012, at least 4 deaths occurred in craft breweries. Before we start discussing the safety concerns for brewing, here's a quick overview of what the brewing process looks like.
It is very important to be sober during the brewing process because there are many safety hazards involved. In order to ensure safety, we are wearing personal protective equipment during our brewing process. We are wearing lab coats to protect our skin from contact with hot equipment and the acid used to sanitize our equipment. Any long hair is tied back to prevent it from being caught in equipment and also to minimize contamination. We are wearing nitrile gloves when dealing with the acid to prevent burns if it comes into contact with our hands. We are wearing safety glasses to protect our eyes. When dealing with the hot process, thermal gloves are used to protect our hands from burns. And finally, we are wearing closed-toed shoes to provide protection from any falling objects or hot fluid. When dealing with the hot process, thermal gloves are used instead of nitrile gloves to protect our hands from burns. Wait, you should use thermal gloves. That can burn you.
Oh, thank you.
Ensuring the workspace is clean is important to prevent tripping and slipping hazards. Closed-toed shoes help to protect feet from any hot liquid. There have been several incidents in the brewing business in recent years as craft breweries have become more popular across the United States. An incident at Harmon Brewing Company caused an employee to have severe burns. While the employee was working with a mash tun, hot malt and water spilled on his foot and leg when the manway burst open due to a sudden increase of pressure in the mash tun. The malt and water mixture was around 200 degrees. It caused the employee to have second and third degree burns and to be out of work for several weeks due to multiple reparative surgeries. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, injuries have increased from 160 in 2011 to 530 in 2014. Sprains, chemical burns, and bruises accounted for half of the injuries occurring in 2014. Another incident occurred at Calhoun's Barbecue and Brewery. A contractor for the craft brewery was inside the fermentation tank when a flash fire erupted. On the day of the accident, the contractor went inside the fermentation tank in order to seal a crack. Unfortunately, the tank was oversaturated with oxygen. As he lit his torch, the spark ignited the oxygen and created a flash fire. The fire caused severe burns over much of his body and killed the contractor 75 days later. An employee at Red Hook Brewery in New Hampshire died during a routine CIP procedure. The employee was cleaning a keg with compressed air when it exploded. OSHA conducted an investigation and found that the airline did not have a proper device that would keep a safe level of pressure inside the keg. Due to this accident, the craft brewery was fined $44,000 and also charged with multiple safety violations. Improper procedures involving cleaning kegs have also caused an incident at Riverside Brewery in California. A brewmaster was cleaning and sanitizing kegs using boiling water. Unfortunately, the brewmaster did not properly purge the keg beforehand, leaving an internal pressure buildup of 16 to 18 psi. When the brewmaster opened the gate valve, approximately 5 gallons of boiling hot water spilled onto the employee. The employee suffered from second-degree burns on his legs, back, and arms, and was hospitalized for 10 days.
The recipe we're brewing today is a Russian Imperial Stout. The grain bill includes 16 pounds of pale Maris Odor Stout, 1.5 pounds of roasted barley, 1 pound of special bee malt, 12 ounces of caramel 60, and 8 ounces of chocolate malt. Also, for the hops, there is 2 ounces of Magnum added at the 60-minute mark.
How's it going, everyone? Just want to first off talk about just our equipment that we're going to be using to make our beer for today. So first off, here we got our mash tun. Basically, this is where we'll put our grains and hot water in, and all that. When you put your grains and the hot water in there, all the sugars or the starches in the grains get converted to sugars that we'll use to later, when the yeast is active in there, we'll convert the sugars to alcohol. Next here, we got our boil kettle. We'll use this basically once our wort has been transferred from here. We'll put it into our boil kettle. We'll boil it for about 60 minutes, and we'll add our hops in to give the beer a little bit of flavor and a good smell. That boils for about 60 minutes, and then this here is our fermentation glass carboy. Once our brewing process is finished, we put all the wort in here, and we'll add the yeast in and cap it with an airlock and start the fermentation. Alright, so before we start brewing, we have to make sure we sanitize everything. So this here is what we're going to use to sanitize all of our equipment. It's called Star San. Basically, it's a concentrated acid. There's a few different acids in there, but we'll pour some of this in our bucket here, make a big old solution of it, and dilute it down so it's not as concentrated. And we'll wash all of our equipment here before we start brewing. I'm just continuing to talk about what we're using today. This is basically exactly what it looks like. Just a big metal spoon we use to stir the beer while it's brewing. This next piece is called a wine thief. Basically what you do, you stick this in your wort, and there's a little valve at the bottom to allow it to fill up. You kind of shake it, fill it up a little bit higher. But you use this to test the gravity of the beer. So you'll test it before you put it in the fermentation vessel, and then after the fermentation is finished, you'll measure your gravity with the hydrometer here, and that will tell you, based on the final initial gravity, what percent alcohol you have. Next, this is just a piece of our hose that we use here just to transfer the wort in between all the different vessels. This here is just a copper coil. We hook it up to a hose. We use it to cool down the beer after it's finished boiling. It's called an auto siphon. Basically, you'll hook up the hose to here, stick it in your whatever you're trying to transfer, give it a few plunges, and that'll start the flow, and you can transfer your liquids to another vessel. And this here is what we use to put our hops in. It's a little bit stained, it's been used a few times, but we put the hops in this bag, and then we'll add it into the boil kettle while the beer is brewing to do our hop additions. And then last of all, this large bag here we put inside of our mash tun. Basically, this will contain all of our grain and allow us to filter out all the grains, so when we transfer the wort from the mash tun to our boil kettle, you're not going to get a bunch of clumpy grains going through. Alright, so I just made up our solution to sanitize everything. Basically, it's just this Star San again. Added 1 ounce per about 5 gallons. So basically now I'm just going to give everything a good rinse that we're going to be using, just so there's no contaminants that are going to get introduced into our beer. Just Give everything a little dunk, rinse it off, just make sure it's good and clean. And the good thing about this sanitizer is, so you can see it's all foamy, but you don't have to rinse it off with water, so you can just let it dry just like it is. So I'll stick it over here on the towel and keep rinsing stuff off. Alright, so I got my sanitized solution in here. I'm just going to use the auto siphon here just to transfer it into our mash tun, just so we can sanitize out the mash tun as well. And it flows.
Okay, for this next step, we're going to be heating up the water to about 170 or 180 degrees Fahrenheit. So to do that, we take the hose and we want to connect it to this propane tank. And now on this we have two valves, one on the hose and one on the tank. And so first of all, we want to open the one on the tank completely, and then we want to regulate it with this valve. So then the gas will slowly flow through here. And then the next step, we want to turn on the timer. And after we do that, we want to push this button down. When we push this button down, it will release gas into this area. And then from that point on, we can light it. Now when we light it, we want to keep this button held down for about another 10-15 seconds. And the reason is because there's a thermocouple on this device. And if it gets too cold, then it will shut off the gas flow, and then the flame will go out.
Alright, so we got our flame going, got our water on top of the flame. We're waiting to heat it up. We're looking for a temperature around probably 180 degrees Fahrenheit. The reason for that is once this water heats up, we're going to add it into our mash tun, and from there we add the grains into it. So once you add the grains into the mash tun, they're significantly colder than the temperature of the water, so it'll bring the overall temperature in the mash tun down, and then it'll do that, and that's what we're looking for it to do. And we're looking for the temperature to get down to 153. That's our mash temp, and then we'll add our grains in there, shut the lid, and let it sit for an hour. So basically we just got to add the grains in here. We added the hot water. We just got to pour the grains in slowly, just so you don't get any like dough balls clump up in there. Other than that, once we get all the grains in there, we'll close the lid and let it sit for about an hour. Alright, so we just finished our mash. It's been sitting in here for just about an hour. Next step is we need to drain off the wort, that's what the liquid is called, inside there, and put it into our boil kettle here. But before we do that, we have to do what's called vorloffing. Basically that involves just draining off a little bit of the liquid here. Basically what you're doing here is letting some of this liquid flow out, and you're making sure there's no grain or any residue flowing out of here. And that also helps compact the grain bed a little bit, so you get some extra filtration that way. Alright, so we're just draining off the wort from the mash tun into our boil kettle. You can see down here it's just running out of the mash tun. Once it finishes, we'll record and see how much volume we have. And then based on that, we'll add a little bit more water so we can get our final boil volume around 6.5 to 7 gallons. Alright, we got all of our wort transferred out of the mash tun. After that second round of adding water, we ended up getting to a final volume like right at 7 gallons. So now we're waiting for it to get up to a boil. One important thing as far as safety goes, once it starts boiling, there's going to be a pretty big foam layer that builds up on top. That's going to want to boil over, so we have to keep an eye on the gas as far as how hot it's getting and kind of stir it around to help that froth layer go down. Once it starts boiling, we'll give you a little shot of that and show you what that looks like. Alright, so we're about to start boiling here. Once we start boiling, we're going to let it boil for about an hour. For this recipe, we only have one hop addition. We add those in right when it starts boiling, so if you want to see, they look like little, kind of like cat food, just little compressed pellets of grains. We'll stick these in a bag and let it go from there. So it's come to boil now. As you can see, it gets pretty foamy at the top. One way to combat the foam is stirring it pretty good. That helps incorporate those proteins back in there, and we also have a little squirt bottle, and it helps, break the surface tension of the bubbles and keep it from boiling over. Alright, so now we just finished the boil. So before we let it cool off using the coil over there, I'm just going to give it a quick stir and let it get like a whirlpool going. That'll let all the sediment and everything settle out to the bottom. So when we transfer it over to the fermenter, we don't bring in all that extra sludge and sediment that sits at the bottom. Alright, just I'm gonna turn the hose on here in just a second. It'll basically just run cooler water through that coil, and then it'll probably take 15 minutes or so to cool it off. We're trying to get it down to about 70 degrees, kind of room temperature, before we put it in the fermenter. Alright, so we've just finished cooling off our wort here. It's at the temperature it needs to be fermented at. So now we're using the auto siphon to transfer it into our fermentation tank. If you can see on here, there is a little nozzle on there. It kind of shoots out the wort like it does. This helps aerate the wort, which helps with the yeast health. So we don't want to introduce oxygen after the yeast has been introduced, but you want to get as much oxygen as you can in the wort before you introduce the yeast, so it has the best chance at fermenting the most sugars into alcohol. Alright, I've just given the wort a nice shake to, again, help get more oxygen into the beer. Now it's time to add the yeast in here. This is the yeast we're using. It's a White Labs ale yeast. It's a little pouch inside, and it's got the liquid yeast in there. So basically, I'm just going to add the yeast in there, and then we'll cap it with the airlock. Alright, we've just added the yeast in there, and you can see just where I poured it down the middle. Just dumped it down the top of the carboy there. Next step is we just got to cap it with the airlock. This is pretty important. Basically what it does, it helps keep the oxygen from getting inside the beer while letting the CO2 released from when the yeast converts the sugars into CO2. It lets the CO2 escape through the tube, bubble out that side, but it doesn't let air come in and enter into the beer. Another safety concern with this is once the yeast gets active and starts, converting all the sugars into CO2 and alcohol, there develops a big foam layer on top of here. It's called a crowson. When that develops, sometimes depending on the beer and how active the yeast is, the foam layer can build up all the way to the top and bubble through the airlock and eventually explode through the top. So part of the design in the carboy is to leave enough room on the top for that big foam layer to develop, or to use a blow-off valve, which basically is a hose that connects into like a bucket or something full of sanitized solution and lets it bubble out that way. But basically that's the whole entire brewing process. We're just going to cap it and put it in a dark spot and let it ferment for about 2 weeks.
Here's a quick time lapse of our brewing process. Thanks for watching.